Today, we are going to talk about World War II. This narration is calm and slow. There is nothing dramatic here. There is no urgency in the words. You do not need to remember dates or names. You can simply listen as the information moves gently from one idea to another. This is history told in a very quiet way. World War II was one of the largest events in human history. It involved many countries across different continents. The war did not begin suddenly for most people. For many, life felt normal at first. People went to work, children went to school, and daily routines continued without much change. The idea of a global war felt distant and abstract. Before the war officially began, the world was already experiencing tension. Many countries were still recovering from World War I. Economies were weak in several places. Jobs were difficult to find. Governments were struggling to keep people calm and hopeful. These problems existed quietly in the background for years. In Europe, political situations were slowly shifting. Some countries felt dissatisfied with earlier agreements. Others felt insecure about their borders and future. These concerns were discussed in meetings, speeches, and newspapers. For most ordinary people, these discussions felt far away from everyday life. Germany, during this time, was undergoing significant changes. Leadership in the country began to focus heavily on national strength and unity. This focus developed gradually. It was not something that transformed overnight. Many citizens simply adapted to the changes without questioning them too deeply. Communication during this period was slower than today. News traveled through newspapers and radio broadcasts. Information often arrived late and without detail. People heard about events in short, simple updates. There was little analysis and even less emotional language. Most reports sounded calm and formal. As the late 1930s approached, small actions began to create larger consequences. Agreements were made, then broken. Borders were discussed, then ignored. These steps did not feel dramatic at the time. They felt administrative and routine. History often moves this way, quietly and without warning. In 1939, the situation changed. Germany invaded Poland. This action marked the official beginning of World War II. The announcement was made through formal statements and radio messages. For many people listening, it sounded like just another piece of news. Few understood what would follow. After the invasion of Poland, other countries slowly became involved. Alliances were activated. Declarations were made. These decisions happened in government offices and meeting rooms. On the streets, life still appeared mostly the same. Shops opened. Trains ran on schedule. People continued their routines. At this stage, World War II had begun, but it had not yet reached its full scale. The early months were marked by uncertainty rather than chaos. Many believed the conflict would be short. Others avoided thinking about it altogether. History was unfolding, but very quietly. This was the beginning of a long and complex global conflict. The early period of World War II was not loud or dramatic. It was slow, uncertain, and filled with ordinary days. In the next part, the war will continue to spread, gradually and steadily, across Europe. As the early stages of World War II continued, much of Europe still appeared calm on the surface. Many cities remained quiet. Streets were orderly, and daily routines continued without major disruption. People read newspapers in the morning and listened to the radio in the evening. The war existed mostly as an idea rather than a daily reality. Governments across Europe were carefully watching one another. Diplomatic conversations were ongoing. Meetings were held, documents were signed, and statements were released. These actions felt slow and procedural. For most citizens, they were simply part of distant political processes that rarely affected everyday life. Several countries were still influenced by the outcomes of World War I. Borders had been redrawn, and some nations felt those decisions were unfair. This dissatisfaction did not always lead to immediate action. Instead, it remained present as quiet resentment. Over time, these unresolved feelings contributed to instability. Economic conditions also played an important role. Many European nations were dealing with unemployment and limited resources. Factories operated below capacity. Wages were often low. These economic pressures shaped political decisions, though they were rarely discussed openly with the public in great detail. In many places, people tried to avoid thinking about another war. Memories of the previous conflict were still strong. Families remembered loss and hardship. Because of this, there was a general desire to maintain peace, even if that peace felt uncertain and fragile. Media coverage during this period was controlled and measured. Reports were brief and formal. There were no constant updates or emotional commentary. Information arrived slowly and often without clear explanation. This made it easier for people to remain detached from events. Some countries began preparing quietly. Supplies were stored. Military training increased slightly. These preparations were not always visible to the public. When they were noticed, they were often explained as routine measures rather than signs of imminent conflict. Travel across Europe was still possible in many areas. Trains continued to run. Borders were crossed with little difficulty. Tourists moved through cities, unaware that these same places would soon look very different. The sense of normalcy lingered longer than expected. As time passed, the political balance in Europe became more unstable. Trust between nations weakened. Agreements were questioned. Still, no single moment clearly announced that a major war was inevitable. The shift from peace to conflict was gradual and unclear. By the end of this period, Europe stood in a quiet state of anticipation. The war had begun, but it had not yet fully arrived. The next phase would bring wider involvement, deeper consequences, and lasting change, unfolding slowly over time. During this period of World War II, Germany continued to move forward with its plans. These movements were not always fast or dramatic. Many actions happened through paperwork, meetings, and formal announcements. To outside observers, it often looked like a series of routine decisions rather than aggressive steps toward a larger conflict. Leadership in Germany emphasized order, structure, and national purpose. Messages were repeated often and delivered in calm, controlled ways. Over time, these ideas became familiar to the population. For many people, they blended into daily life and no longer felt unusual or alarming. Military activity increased slowly. Training exercises became more common. Equipment production rose at a steady pace. Factories adjusted their schedules and output. These changes were framed as necessary preparations rather than signs of long-term war. As a result, they did not create immediate panic. Other European nations responded carefully. Some increased their own defenses. Others waited, hoping that the situation would stabilize. Communication between governments continued, though trust was limited. Decisions were often delayed, and responses were measured and cautious. Territories began to change control in quiet stages. Maps were updated. Borders shifted slightly. These adjustments were recorded in official documents and news reports. For most civilians, these changes felt distant and abstract, happening far away from their homes. Life inside Germany followed a predictable rhythm. People worked, rested, and followed schedules. Public spaces remained organized. Transportation systems functioned normally. The presence of war was subtle, existing more in planning rooms than on city streets. Information was shared selectively. News focused on progress and stability. Details were limited. This created an environment where uncertainty existed, but clarity did not. Many people accepted what they heard without questioning it deeply. As months passed, Germany's involvement in the war became more visible to the rest of Europe. However, the pace remained controlled. Events unfolded step by step. There were no sudden transformations, only gradual developments that slowly altered the political landscape. This stage of the war was defined by preparation and positioning. The full scale of the conflict had not yet appeared. The groundwork was being laid quietly. In the next part, the war will begin to spread more widely across Europe, changing the situation in a more noticeable way. As time passed, World War II began to spread more widely across Europe. This expansion did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, moving from one region to another. For many people, the changes were noticed only after they had already taken place. News arrived slowly, often days or weeks later. Several countries became involved through formal declarations and alliances. These decisions were announced in official statements, usually read in calm voices on the radio. The language was careful and restrained. There was little emotion in the delivery. To listeners, it sounded distant and procedural. Military movements increased across borders. Troops traveled by train and vehicle. Equipment was transported quietly and efficiently. These movements were planned in advance and carried out according to schedules. From a distance, they appeared orderly and controlled rather than chaotic. Cities across Europe began to adjust to new conditions. Some areas introduced restrictions. Lights were dimmed at night. Certain supplies became harder to find. These adjustments were introduced slowly, allowing people time to adapt. Daily life continued, but with small changes. Air raids became more common in certain regions. When they occurred, they followed a pattern. Sirens sounded. People moved to shelters. Afterward, routines resumed. Over time, these events became part of the background of life rather than moments of constant fear. Governments communicated with their populations through simple messages. Instructions were clear and repetitive. Stay calm. Follow guidelines. Continue working. The goal was stability, not urgency. This approach helped maintain a sense of order. Despite the growing scale of the war, many areas remained physically untouched for long periods. In these places, the war felt distant. People discussed it quietly, often without strong opinions. It was something happening elsewhere, reported through short updates and brief headlines. As the conflict expanded, the complexity increased. More countries became involved. More resources were committed. Still, the overall pace felt slow. Events blended together, forming a continuous flow rather than distinct moments. By this stage, it was clear that World War II would not end quickly. The war had spread across Europe in a steady and methodical way. The next phase would involve even wider participation, including countries beyond Europe, changing the nature of the conflict further. For a long time, the United States remained outside of World War II. The country observed events from a distance. News from Europe and Asia reached Americans through newspapers and radio broadcasts. These reports were usually brief and factual. For many people, the war felt far away and not directly connected to daily life. During this period, life in the United States continued with relative normalcy. People went to work, attended school, and followed their usual routines. The economy was slowly recovering from earlier difficulties. While the war was discussed, it was not always a central concern for most families. The United States government maintained a cautious position. Officials spoke about neutrality and national interests. Decisions were made slowly and carefully. Public statements were measured and calm. There was no immediate sense of urgency in the messaging. As the war progressed, the United States became more involved indirectly. Supplies were sent to allied nations. Factories increased production. These efforts were presented as support measures rather than acts of war. For many citizens, these changes felt administrative and distant. Everything changed in December of 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, a naval base in Hawaii. The news spread quickly across the country. Radio broadcasts interrupted regular programming. The information was clear but restrained. The significance of the event became apparent over time. After the attack, the United States officially entered World War II. This decision was announced through formal channels. The language used was direct and serious, but not emotional. For many Americans, it marked the beginning of a new phase of daily life. Following the declaration of war, changes began to appear gradually. Factories shifted to wartime production. Young men registered for military service. Rationing programs were introduced. These adjustments were explained through instructions and guidelines, delivered calmly to the public. Despite these changes, everyday life remained structured. People adapted to new rules. Communities adjusted their routines. The war became part of the background, influencing daily decisions without overwhelming them. At this point, World War II had become truly global. With the involvement of the United States, the scale of the conflict expanded further. The war continued, moving steadily toward its later stages and eventual conclusion. As World War II moved into its later years, the conflict continued in a steady and prolonged manner. By this time, many countries were fully committed to the war effort. Large numbers of people were involved in work related to the conflict. Despite this, daily life followed predictable patterns in many places. Military operations during this period were extensive but often repetitive. Plans were made, carried out, and reviewed. Progress was measured in small steps. Reports described movements, positions, and outcomes using technical language. These descriptions lacked emotion and focused on routine details. In Europe, fighting continued across multiple regions. Cities experienced long periods of adjustment rather than constant crisis. People learned how to live with restrictions and uncertainty. Over time, these conditions became familiar and less noticeable. In the Pacific, the war followed a similar pattern of gradual movement. Battles occurred over long periods. Control shifted slowly from one area to another. News of these events reached the public in short summaries, often without explanation or context. As resources were used and replaced, production remained steady. Factories continued operating on fixed schedules. Supplies were managed carefully. These systems were designed for consistency rather than speed, reinforcing the sense of routine. Eventually, the war began to slow. In Europe, Germany surrendered in 1945. The announcement was made formally and calmly. For many people, the news felt quiet rather than celebratory. It marked the end of a long process rather than a sudden moment. In the Pacific, the conflict ended later that same year. Japan surrendered after extended fighting and significant damage. This announcement, like others, was delivered in an official and restrained manner. With the war officially over, attention shifted to rebuilding and adjustment. Soldiers returned gradually. Factories changed production again. Governments focused on planning for peace. Life did not transform instantly. The transition was slow and measured. World War II ended not with a single dramatic moment, but through a series of formal decisions and announcements. The conclusion came quietly, bringing closure to years of continuous and methodical conflict. With World War II over, life slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. Cities that had experienced disruption began to adjust. People resumed their daily routines with small changes. Factories shifted back from wartime production to civilian goods. Governments focused on planning, reconstruction, and careful management of resources. The pace was steady, measured, and slow. For many individuals, the experience of the war remained in the background of memory rather than as an immediate presence. Families continued their lives, often without speaking much about what had occurred. News reports recounted events in calm, factual terms, allowing society to process history in a deliberate way. The aftermath of the war involved rebuilding infrastructure, reorganizing governments, and managing social change. These processes were gradual and methodical. Cities were repaired over years. Economies stabilized step by step. Communities adapted slowly, learning to navigate a world that had shifted quietly but profoundly. Education, work, and daily activities returned to a predictable pattern. People engaged with news and history in measured doses. History books recorded events with careful language, emphasizing dates, treaties, and formal agreements. Emotions were understated, and the focus was on facts rather than drama. Even as the world moved forward, the memory of World War II lingered as a series of quiet lessons. The war itself became part of the broader context of human experience, studied slowly, reflected upon carefully, and recalled without urgency. There were no sudden endings or dramatic revelations, only a continuous, gradual understanding of events that had unfolded over many years. In this way, history can be experienced as a slow, steady flow of information. Listening to it calmly, without rush or excitement, allows one to follow the passage of time, the movement of nations, and the unfolding of events at a deliberate pace. This slow approach to history offers a quiet perspective, letting the mind rest while absorbing the knowledge of a world that changed over many years in small, measured steps. As this narration comes to a close, you may notice a sense of calm. The details of battles, leaders, and events fade gently, leaving only the quiet record of time and human action. You can relax and allow the slow rhythm of history to settle, knowing that the story of World War II has been told in its full, measured, and quiet form.